Hi there. So today we are going to look at how do we know what we know about history. This could really be applied to any subject, but we're going to look specifically at history. And what we're going to be learning about is two types of sources. Sources being those places from which we draw information. So if I wanted to learn about the day I was born, sources might be my birth record and my mom and my aunt that was there, right? So we're going to learn about sources of information, and specifically we're going to learn about two different types of sources: primary sources and secondary sources. We're going to hear what the difference is between them, and we're going to hear about how to use them. How are they trustworthy or not trustworthy? Okay? So let's take a look. So some definitions. Primary source. A primary source, and when you hear primary, I want you to think primary grades, the primary person, that first number that means first. Okay? A primary source is a first-hand account, record, or evidence about a person, place, object, or an event. What I mean by this is this information has not been pre-processed. Okay? This is someone's first-hand account. It may not be very reliable because a lot of people's first-hand accounts are incorrect, but it has not been processed by someone else for us, okay? So think I was there, or the writer was there. So if the writer was there, or it's their own original idea. So not only is this applied to history as a primary source, but if we're talking about something like literature or physics, if you have a source or an article that is someone's own original ideas, then it is a primary source. Okay, primary is firsthand. First person to say those ideas. First contact, okay? It's not a step removed, right? So if you were playing, how many steps does it take you to get to Kevin Bacon, right? This would be a one interaction. All right. Secondary source. What do we see in that word? Secondary. This is something that is second-hand, meaning the account is not original. Okay, so this is an account, record, or evidence that comes from an original or primary source, meaning it is not the original source. It is the secondary view of it. Okay? With secondary sources, this includes anything that has been processed and that has been previewed in order to create something more understandable, more basic, more specific to an audience. It is not the original source of information, okay? So think I heard or I learned about it from someone who was there. Okay, so let's look at some examples. So types of secondary sources. What makes something a secondary source? I want you to think of all different kinds of secondary sources. So I want you to think about what is a secondary source. A secondary source is a second-hand account, or it's anything that is not the original. All right, so we've already read that. Let's look at some examples. Textbooks and encyclopedias. You will often come across textbooks, and even if you don't use textbooks, you will come across encyclopedias, okay? Historians or researchers take what they have learned from studying history or any topic to write a description of events, people, and main ideas to help you better understand the past. Okay, so if you were going to read all of those original documents, everyone's journals, the newspapers, not only would it take an immense amount of time, but it would be probably very hard to understand unless that was your focus of study. Historians, for example, have spent years breaking down the original artifacts or the original documents to give context, to come up with a holistic picture, and that's what they present in a textbook or an encyclopedia. Okay? No person sat down at the beginning of American Revolution and wrote a history of the American Revolution. It was current events. Now, after the fact, someone has gone back, read through all of the material, and consolidated it into a history, into a textbook. So it's a secondary source. It's not those first original documents. It's something that someone has already processed for us. Some other examples are nonfictions. Many historians write books about their research of historical persons or events. So biographies, encyclopedias, historical nonfictions. This could be anything from nonfiction for children or giant biographies. It's a large amount of information that's been processed together into a reasonable format for you. So it is a secondary source. A documentary. A documentary can cover all kinds of ideas. You might talk about history, you might present. This is considered a secondary source. They are deciding what is important for you. The director, in this example, is deciding what is important for you to see and what is not important for you to see. And they're processing it in a consumable fashion, in a way that's easy to understand. But they are making massive decisions about what to show you and what to not show you. Okay? Primary and secondary sources are not necessarily more trustworthy than the other. Just because something's a secondary source doesn't mean it's better. It also doesn't mean it's necessarily worse. Each source needs to stand on its own credibility. Who is telling the story? Why are they telling the story? How much research have they done? Why might their story be clouded or incorrect? Okay, we need to consider that whether we're looking at documentaries or primary sources or secondary sources. So think about some ideas of a secondary source. What are some of the important characteristics of something that is a secondary source? Well, it's secondhand, meaning it is not the original. This was not the person on the scene. Okay? This is secondhand information. I heard about it from somebody else. It is a summary of what is believed to have taken place, but it is not the actual recording of what took place. All right? And it usually comes from examining primary sources. So we really need to understand those primary sources. Otherwise, we're going to get confused. Okay? So we've already covered these. These is just a review. Some example of secondary sources. Okay. What are some types of primary sources? What makes something a primary source? Primary sources are those original documents or those original interviews or those original journal entries, okay? First-hand accounts. We already went over this. Okay. So, diaries, letters, or journals are considered original documents. So they are primary sources. For example, think about a historical time period. If I wanted to learn about Abraham Lincoln, I could go and read one of the many biographies of Abraham Lincoln, or I could read Abraham Lincoln's diary. They're going to give me two different perspectives, right? The book written about him, the biography, is probably going to give me a nice, easy to understand, holistic image of Abraham Lincoln. His diary is going to give me personal insight, his feelings, his emotions, his inner thoughts, right? Two different perspectives. The diary is his firsthand account, so it's primary. The biography is an outside perspective, and so it is secondary. So let's look at some more primary sources. Historical documents. So this is a great list for you. Census records, marriage license, military enlistment papers, tax records, death certificates, a bunch of stuff that we generally find boring but contain a lot of information, right? If I want to find out my ancestry, one of the best ways to look at that is marriage certificates and death certificates, because it's a very clear way for me to see who married who and who died when, okay? But that takes a long time. A lot of processing to do. So often, instead of reading these primary sources, we choose to read secondary sources. Finally, newspapers. If we look at old newspapers, they are considered primary sources because they demonstrate what was life like at that time period. So if we look at this is the Omaha Daily Bee on Tuesday, December 23rd, 1890. This tells us what's going on in this time period. What were things that people were shopping for then, right? What kind of concerns did they have? What were they talking about? What were their letters about, right? Newspapers are a great primary source because they give a historical perspective. Now remember, just because it is a primary source does not mean that it's more reliable. What if I read a newspaper that was written in 1890 and it had a very racist slant? It might be very biased, okay? It might tell things that are not exactly true. But it is primary. It gives us first-hand account of what was happening. All right, photos, obviously when they are not affected, give us lots of information. We can judge it for ourselves. Nobody is processing the photo for us. We do the processing for ourselves. Or artifacts, objects. Nobody's processing, for example, this doll that was created around the late 1800s. No one is giving me a summary of it or explaining it. I can tangibly look at it and learn about the time period. I have to draw information from this primary source. Interviews are a great primary source if they're first-hand account, meaning I didn't hear this from someone else, but I'm telling you what happened to me. What did I see? Okay? Always keeping it personal. So to make something a primary source, it's first-hand. It lets us see what life was like during a period of time. Some examples are journals, diaries, letters, historical documents, newspapers, photos, and objects. All right, so let's take a look at these. Is something a primary or secondary source? You read a biography of Alexander Graham Bell written by Edward S. Grosvenor. Oh, I said that wrong. This is going to be a secondary source because we're learning about Alexander, not from Alexander, but we're learning about Alexander from Edwin. Okay? Let's look at this. You find from the National Archives Albert Einstein's immigration record when he immigrated to the United States. This is a primary source because it is an original document, historical document. No one has adjusted this document for us. You are looking at a photo of a 1945 high school football team to see how the sport has changed. Is this a primary or secondary source? This is a primary source because nobody is changing the information for you. You are having to process the information on your own. It is a first-hand account. Nothing has happened to the photo. This is the original photo. To learn more about World War II, you watch a PBS documentary titled The War. Is this a primary or secondary source? This is a secondary source because the director has taken the time to process the information for you. Okay? You want to learn more about the gold miners in California. You read this 1850 letter written by Alexander Barrington. Is this a primary source? Yes, because nobody has adjusted the letter. You're reading his first-hand account. He was in the time period. It is a historical document, so it is a primary source. All right, so take a look at these answers. Write them down. Refer to them later. Let's keep going. Okay, very, very quickly. How to critique primary sources. You always need to consider the source. Primary sources are not necessarily better than secondary sources. Memory often plays an effect, and so do personal bias. You need to consider the context. For who was this written, and when was it written? Finally, remember why you are using the text. How to critique secondary sources. Consider who's publishing it. Look at the works cited list. Compare this against similar resources. and consider who it was written for. All right, that's all we have.